The bollard was warm. That is what I keep coming back to. 41 degrees on the causeway, a north wind running steady at 12 knots, no vessel at the east berth, no vessel scheduled at the east berth for the remainder of the calendar month, and the mushroom-shaped iron bollard at the end of the east berth was warm enough under my bare palm that I pulled my hand back before I understood why. It was 3:02 local. My shift book, which I filled out later that morning sitting at the booth with the radio muttering to itself, records the air temperature, the wind, the absence of any scheduled activity, and a single line in the remarks column that reads, "Bollard warm, east berth, no cause identified." I initialed it. I did not sign it. Rule 7. My name is Elias Marsh. I spent 19 years at sea, most of them as a second mate on bulk carriers and a few on product tankers working the Gulf Run. My left knee finished itself on a pilot ladder in Corpus Christi in the summer of 2022, and after the surgeries and the appeal and the paperwork, I was medically retired from active sea service at 46 years old. I kept my credentials current because a man with my background and no ship is a man with a hole where his week used to be. I took 11 months of dock work and port captain relief shifts that did not pay, and in March of last year I answered a job listing for a solo overnight watchman position at a place called Causeway Terminal 3 on Marin Island, 41 nautical miles off the mid-Atlantic coast. The listing used the phrase mariner preferred. It paid hourly, offered a furnished room in the old pilot cottage, and required the applicant to hold a valid TWIC card and a clean record. I had both. I interviewed by phone with a man named Halsey, who sounded tired and careful, and who asked me exactly 3 questions about my experience, and 7 about whether I could be alone for long stretches without difficulty. I said yes to all 7. I was not lying. Marin Island has a working lighthouse, a seasonal ferry dock that runs from April to October, 3 permanent residents in a cluster of houses near the South Cove, and the terminal. The terminal was built in 1968 as a bunkering station for coastal freight traffic. It was partially decommissioned in 1994 when the shipping lanes shifted east, and by the time I arrived the facility operated only the west berth and shed 2, with fueling windows posted Monday, Wednesday and Friday, 0600 to 1400. The east berth, sheds 3 and 4, the old pump station, the tide gauge and the north storage tanks were on a maintenance-only status. I was told during orientation that the maintenance status meant the structures were kept from falling into the water, but nothing more. I was told this by Halsey on my first morning, and he was standing inside shed 4 with his back to the transfer pump when he told me, and I did not think anything of it at the time. My routine, once I learned it, was simple. I drove a small electric utility cart from the pilot cottage to the terminal at 21:45, relieved the day shift in the booth, performed a walk-around of the active facilities at 22:15, returned to the booth, monitored 4 closed-circuit channels, logged weather and tide at the top of each hour, performed a second walk-around at 02:15, and signed out at 0600 when the morning man arrived. Between walk-arounds I was expected to remain in the booth. The booth is an elevated 10 by 10 structure with windows on 3 sides, a steel door, a marine radio set to channel 11 with channel 16 monitoring, a CCTV console with 4 feeds, a coffee maker, a space heater, a tide table, a binder of standing orders, and a laminated card pinned above the radio. The laminated card was titled Night Watchman, Causeway Terminal 3. Posted rules. It had been laminated more than once. The corners were rounded from handling. There were 7 items printed on it. Halsey walked me through the card on the second morning of orientation, sitting across from me at the booth desk with a cup of coffee. He did not drink. I remember noticing that he read each rule aloud without looking at the card, which meant he had them memorized, which meant he had been reading them aloud to new watchmen for a long time. I remember also that he did not explain any of them. He read them, asked if I had questions. And when I asked about the 0240 to 0315 window on the east berth, he said, "The east berth is maintenance only. There is nothing to see there. The rule is there so you do not waste time looking." He said it the way a man says a thing he has said 1,000 times and no longer hears himself saying. Rule 1 stated that between 2:40 and 3:15 local, the east berth was designated non-observational, and that closed-circuit monitoring from the booth was sufficient and authorized. Rule 2 addressed the transfer pump at Shed 4. If the pump activated outside of posted fueling windows, I was not to approach, not to log, and not to contact the harbour master. Thermal expansion, the rule said. Self-correcting. Rule 3 concerned the seabirds that roosted along the causeway railing. I was not to disturb them, not to startle them, and not to count them. If a bird departed its roost during the 0240 to 0315 window, I was to remain in the booth until the full window had elapsed. Rule 4 was a radio protocol. Acknowledge Channel 11 traffic with call sign and position only. Do not respond to hails addressed to Terminal 3 actual. The correct station call sign was Causeway 3. Rule 5 dealt with mooring line strain on the east berth. If I heard lines under load, I was to verify berth occupancy via CCTV only, not by direct observation. If CCTV showed a vessel, I was to log vessel presence per standard format. If CCTV showed the berth empty while strain was audible, I was to log routine harmonic and continue the shift. Rule 6 concerned the stairwell between booth level and causeway level. The stairwell contained 4 landings. If I counted otherwise on descent, I was to return to the booth, wait 15 minutes, and descend again. I was not to ascend via a stairwell that had presented more than 4 landings. Rule 7 stated that at shift end, I was to sign out in the shift book using initials only. Full signatures were reserved for incident reports. There would be no incident reports. I read the card twice while Halsey drank his cold coffee. I did not laugh. I did not ask what kind of place makes rules about counting stairs. I had spent 19 years reading HSE postings and safety bulletins from port authorities that varied from the sensible to the superstitious, and I had learned that rules at the edge of an operation usually existed because somebody had once done the forbidden thing and something had gone wrong afterward. That was the charitable reading. The uncharitable reading was that somewhere back in the facility's history, a manager had been spooked by an owl and written a memo. I assumed on that first morning that the truth was somewhere between. I asked Halsey one question. I asked him who had written the rules. He said, "They've been added to. The first ones go back to the old operator. The last ones are more recent." He said it the way a man says a thing he has thought about and decided not to say more about. I did not push. A new man does not push on his first morning. My first 2 shifts were quiet. The facility at night is mostly dark. The only significant lighting is a sodium lamp over the west berth, a low-wattage string along the causeway railing, and the red obstruction beacon on top of Shed 2. The east berth has no lighting. The pump station at Shed 4 has a single bulb over the service door that I was instructed to leave off. The booth itself is dim by design, with red-filtered interior lamps to preserve night vision. On my first shift, I walked the west berth at 22:15 and again at 02:15 and noted nothing unusual. On my second shift, I did the same. On my second shift, I also noticed that the CCTV feed for the east berth had a slight horizontal distortions between 240 and 315, a kind of rolling band across the image, and that the distortion cleared at 316 on the dot. I noted it and assumed a timer on the camera or a scheduled sync pulse from the old equipment. I wrote feedband 0240 to 0315, likely sync in the remarks column, and initialed it. On my third shift, the transfer pump at Shed 4 activated at 2:51. I was standing at the booth window with a mug of instant coffee when I heard it. The sound came through the dock plates first as a low vibration under my boots, and then through the air as a steady mechanical hum at the pitch of a heavy-duty transfer pump under moderate load. I knew that pitch. I had listened to pumps like it for 19 years. The pump at Shed 4 was a 400 horsepower centrifugal unit that had been installed in 1991 and was, according to Halsey, mothballed since 1994. I stood at the window for perhaps 10 seconds, trying to convince myself I was hearing wind across the shed. 2 vents. I was not. The sound was too regular and too low, and it was coming from the wrong direction. I looked towards Shed 4 because that is what a man does when he hears a sound. I looked for maybe 4 seconds. Then I remembered Rule 2, and I looked away, and I sat down at the booth desk, and I did not write anything in the shift book, and I drank the coffee while the pump ran. It ran for 11 minutes. At 3:02 it stopped. The silence afterward was not ordinary silence. It was the kind of silence you get in a machinery space when a running system shuts down and the fans are still spinning down and the air is still settling, except there were no fans and there was no air settling. It was the silence of a space that had been occupied and was now unoccupied, and I registered the difference even though I could not have told you, sitting there, what had been occupying it. At 0316, the CCTV distortion band on the eastberth feed cleared as it had the night before. I did not log the pump activation. Rule 2. I did note the feed band clearing, because that was a different event and had its own precedent in my log. I signed out at 600 with my initials and drove the cart back to the cottage and slept badly. In the afternoon, I went back to the booth before my shift started, and I opened the pump log binder, which sat on a shelf beside the standing orders. The pump log binder covered the transfer pump at Shed 4, and nothing else. It was kept in a separate binder because the pump had its own service history and its own maintenance cycle. The most recent entries, in the handwriting of various watchmen over the past few years, showed the pump activating at 2:51 on almost every night of every month. The duration of each activation was between 11 and 13 minutes. The remarks column for each entry said thermal expansion in one hand or TE in another, or sometimes just a check mark. I flipped backward through the binder. 2023, 2022, 2021. Every night. 2015. Every night. 2011. Every night. The handwriting changed. The ink changed. The pages yellowed. But the 0251 activation did not. I went all the way back to the oldest entries in that binder, which were dated 2011, and every entry showed the same thing. I shelved the binder and sat at the desk and looked at the laminated card above the radio and read Rule 2 again. Pump activity outside windows is attributed to thermal expansion and is self-correcting. I thought about thermal expansion. I thought about the fact that a 400 horsepower centrifugal pump does not run for 11 minutes a night for 11 years because of thermal expansion. Thermal expansion does not pressurize a line. Thermal expansion does not require electricity, and the pump at Shed 4 had electricity because I had heard it. I checked the electrical panel for Shed 4 on my walk around that night. The breaker for the transfer pump was in the on position. The breaker for shed 4 lighting and auxiliary was in the off position. The pump was receiving power. It was only the lights that had been mothballed. I did not note this in the log. I was not sure yet whether noting it would be logging the pump in violation of Rule 2 or noting an electrical status in compliance with routine. I left it unwritten and returned to the booth and sat through the 02 42 03 15 window with my hands folded on the desk and my eyes on the CCTV feeds and the sound of the pump running in my boots. On my 5th shift, I found the original rule book. The booth has a steel desk with 3 drawers. The top drawer contains pens, forms, and a small first aid kit. The middle drawer contains the shift book and the current laminated card and a spare. The bottom drawer contains older material, a flashlight with a dead battery, a stack of obsolete tide tables, a ring binder with the word "Standing Orders" in black marker on the spine, and, underneath all of it, a thin booklet stapled at the corner and printed on the kind of paper that offices used in the early 90s. The cover read, "Night Watch, Causeway Terminal 3. Posted Rules, July 1994. I pulled it out and laid it on the desk under the red lamp and opened it. It had 4 rules. Rule 1 was the east berth observational restriction, worded slightly differently but identical in substance to the current Rule 1. Rule 2 was the pump rule, also essentially unchanged. Rule 3 was the bird rule, although the 1994 version did not include the phrase "or counted." Rule 4 was the radio protocol, and the 1994 version did not mention Terminal 3 actual at all. It simply said, "Acknowledge Channel 11 traffic with call sign and position only." That was it. 4 rules. No stairwell. No mooring line strain. No sign-out protocol. I sat with the booklet open in front of me for a long time. The current laminated card had 7 rules. The 1994 booklet had 4. 3 rules had been added over the decades, and each addition had been folded into the laminated card as though it had always been there. I thought about what kind of events would prompt the additions. Rule 5, the mooring line strain rule, suggested that at some point a watchman had heard lines under load on the east berth and had looked out the window, and that what he had seen or not seen had been sufficient for the rule to be written. Rule 6, the stairwell rule, suggested that at some point a watchman had counted 5 landings on the way down. Rule 7, the sign-out protocol, suggested that at some point full signatures had been written in the shift book and that something about those signatures had caused a change in policy. I put the 1994 booklet back in the bottom drawer. I did not take it with me. I had a sense, even then, that the booth preferred its documents where it had put them. Over the next 2 shifts, I listened more carefully. I did not look at the east berth during the window. I did not log the pump. I did not disturb the birds. But I listened, and I paid attention to what my body was doing in the booth between 2:40 and 3:15, and I began to notice things. The booth's interior air pressure dropped during the window. Not dramatically. My ears did not pop. But the space heater cycled differently, and the mug of coffee on the desk cooled faster than ambient conditions should have cooled it. And once or twice, I felt the particular pressure in my sinuses that I associate with a storm front moving through. Except there was no storm front. And the barometer on the wall, which I checked, did not register any change. I noted none of this in the log. I did not know where I would have noted it. On the 9th night, I made a mistake. It was a small mistake, and in ordinary circumstances it would have been nothing. But Rule 3 had been specific, and I had failed to observe it. and the consequences, such as they were, began almost immediately. A gull had roosted on the causeway railing about 15 yards from the booth. I had noticed it during the 22:15 walk-around. A large herring gull, adult plumage, settled in for the night. It was still there at 02:15 on my second walk-around. I returned to the booth and sat through the window. At 2:47, 7 minutes into the restricted period, I carried my coffee mug to the small sink at the back of the booth to rinse it, and in turning I clipped the edge of the desk with my hip, and the binder of standing orders, which I had left open to a reference page, fell to the floor with the flat, heavy sound that a binder makes when it hits linoleum. The booth window was open an inch for ventilation. The sound carried. The gull, which had been roosting, lifted off the railing and flew across the causeway from the west side to the east side. It took perhaps 3 seconds to make the crossing. I watched it because I was at the back of the booth and turning, and my eyes tracked it through the side window before I remembered that I was not supposed to be watching birds during the window, and by the time I had looked away, the gull was already over the east berth and continuing east over the water, and gone. I stood at the sink for a moment with the mug in my hand. The booth was quiet. The pump was running. And then, without any sound I could attribute to a source, the air pressure in the booth dropped hard enough that my ears did pop. A sharp, sudden drop, the way a pressure door seals. I felt it in my sinuses and at the back of my throat, and I swallowed to clear it, and I stood at the sink for perhaps 10 seconds before I turned around and looked at the CCTV console. The east berth feed showed a ship at the east berth. It was a medium-sized vessel. I would have called it a coastal tanker by the silhouette, perhaps 140 meters, perhaps a little less. It was moored portside to the berth, 3 lines forward, 3 lines aft, 2 springs. The lines were under load. A transfer hose ran from the ship's manifold to the pump station at Shed 4. The ship had no visible name on the hull. No flag was flying. The deck was dark. The wheelhouse was dark. There were no crew visible on deck, and no crew visible on the berth. The horizontal distortion band I had grown used to was not present on the feed. The image was clean. I walked to the east-facing window of the booth, which looked directly at the east berth. I did not intend to violate Rule 1. I simply forgot, for about 2 seconds, that Rule 1 existed, because my body was responding to the mismatch between the feed and the window, the way a mariner's body responds to a mismatch between the chart and the sounding. The window showed an empty berth. No ship, no lines, no hose. The sodium lamp from the west berth threw enough light across the water that I could see the bollards on the east berth clearly, and they were bare. There was no vessel at the east berth. The CCTV showed one. The window showed none. I remembered Rule 1. I stepped back from the window. I returned to the console. The feed still showed the ship. I looked at the clock. 2:53. 22 minutes remaining in the window. I sat down at the desk. I did not log the vessel. Rule 5 was specific. If CCTV showed a vessel, I was to log vessel presence per standard format. But the window showed none, and I had looked at the window, which Rule 1 prohibited during the window, and I was no longer certain which piece of evidence was the one I was supposed to trust. I sat at the desk with my hands flat on its surface, and I listened to the pump run. I listened to the mooring lines. I could hear them now that I was listening. A slow creak under load. The rhythmic groan of fibre rope stretching against iron. I had not heard them before the gull. I heard them clearly now. At 3:15 they stopped. At 3:16 the feed showed the berth empty. The distortion band returned for a fraction of a second and then cleared. The pump shut down at 3:02, as it always did, and the 11 minutes between 3:02 and 3:15, during which the lines remained audible and the feed remained occupied, were the worst 11 minutes of my time at the terminal to that point, because I understood, sitting there, that something was being offloaded, and that the offloading was not the hose and the pump and the fuel, or not only those things. I signed out at 6 o'clock with my initials. I drove to the cottage and I did not sleep. I sat on the edge of the bed and I thought about Rule 3. The rule had been specific. If a bird departed its roost during the window, remain in the booth until the full window had elapsed. I had remained in the booth. I had not violated that part of the rule, but I had startled the bird, and the rule had said not to. I had failed a component of Rule 3, and the consequence had been the pressure drop and the appearance of the vessel on the feed. I could not say whether the rule existed to prevent the consequence, or to prevent me from registering a consequence that occurred anyway. I could not say which reading was worse. I spent the next afternoon in the small office behind Shed 2, which contained the facility's historical records in 4 filing cabinets that had not been reorganized since the 90s. Halsey let me in without asking what I wanted. I told him I was reviewing procedure history because I liked to understand the facilities I worked in. He nodded the way he had nodded when I had asked about the rule writer. I do not think he believed me. I do not think he cared. I think he had seen watchmen go through the files before, and he had reached the point where he let them do what they were going to do. The top drawer of the first cabinet held tide charts from 1968 through 1994. I pulled a handful and laid them on the office desk beside the current NOAA charts, which were pinned to the wall. The historical charts, produced by the original operator, showed tides at Causeway 3 that matched NOAA predictions to within a few inches and a few minutes. The tide times and the tide heights matched. This was expected and reassuring. I put the historical charts back. Then I pulled the tide log from 1995 onward, which was the facility's own measured tide gauge record, updated by each watch. I compared the measured log to the predicted NOAA values for the same date. The measurements matched the predictions for every day of every year, with one exception. Every measured tide log between 2:40 and 3:15, local showed a water level approximately 1.4 feet higher than NOAA predicted for the same window. The discrepancy was consistent across decades. It did not appear at any other time of day. The gauge returned to predicted values by 3:20. I checked the gauge's calibration records. The gauge had been recalibrated in 1997, 2004, 2012, and 2019. After each recalibration, the discrepancy persisted. I sat in the office with the chart spread across the desk, and I understood that the east berth was being loaded during the window, and that the loading was heavy enough to depress the berth pilings enough to raise the apparent water level by 1.4 feet, and that this had been happening for 3 decades, and that the tide gauge, which was an automated instrument with no opinion on the matter, had been recording it faithfully, and that no one had ever changed the rule. I went back further. The second cabinet held personnel files. I did not have authorization to read personnel files, but the cabinet was unlocked and Halsey was not in the office, and I had passed the point where authorization mattered to me. I found the roster of night watchmen going back to 1994. There were 17 names. Most had served 1 or 2 years. 1 had served 9. 4 had left without formal separation paperwork, which in a facility this size meant they had simply stopped coming to work. Their files were thinner than the others. There was no address forwarding. There were no exit interviews. The most recent of the 4 to leave without paperwork was a man named Donnelly, who had been the watchman for 14 months before my hire, and whose final shift book entry, which I found by cross-referencing dates in the current shift book, was dated a Tuesday in February. He had signed out with his initials at 0600 that morning. He had not returned the following night. Halsey had worked the booth himself for 3 weeks until my hire went through. In the back of Donnelly's personnel folder was a small spiral notebook, the pocket kind. It was not part of official records. Someone had tucked it into the folder. The paper was water-stained along one edge. The first page had his name on it. The next 40 pages contained shift-by-shift notes in a tight, careful hand. Most of the notes were ordinary. Weather, tide, traffic, equipment status. Toward the middle of the notebook, the notes became more focused. Donnelly had begun tracking the pump activation time to the second, the feed distortion duration to the second, and the tide gauge discrepancy to the 10th of a foot. He was doing what I was doing, 3 months later than he had done it. On one page, dated in January, he had written a phrase at the bottom of the page and underlined it twice. The phrase was, "They are counting me." Nothing else on that page. On the next page, also in January, he had written the same phrase, not underlined. On the page after that, dated 3 days later, he had written it again. After that, he stopped writing it, and the notes in the last weeks of the notebook were ordinary again, weather and tide, until they stopped. I sat with the notebook for a long time. I did not take it. I put it back in the folder, and I closed the cabinet, and I went out of the office, and I walked the causeway in daylight, and I looked at the east berth, and I looked at the bollards, and I thought about Rule 3, which said that the birds were not to be counted. I thought about what a bird on the railing would represent to a system that was loading something across the berth at 02:51 every night. I thought about what a watchman in the booth would represent. I thought about the phrase, "They are counting me." And I thought about the fact that Donnelly had written it 3 times and then stopped. And I thought about whether he had stopped because he had stopped believing it, or because he had understood that writing it was itself a form of being counted. On my 12th shift, the stairwell had 5 landings. The stairwell connects the booth, which is elevated on a steel frame above the causeway, to the causeway deck. It is an exterior stair, open to the air, with galvanized treads and a pipe railing. It has always 4 landings. I had descended it 22 times in the course of my employment, and it had always had 4 landings. On the 12th shift, walking down at 02:15 for the second walk-around, I counted 5. I counted them the way a man counts stairs without meaning to. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And I stopped on the 5th landing with my hand on the rail, and I looked up the way I had come, and I counted again, going up with my eyes, and there were 5. I did not continue down. I turned around and ascended, counting as I went. 5 landings. I reached the booth. I closed the door. I sat at the desk. I looked at the clock. 2:17. I set a timer on my wristwatch for 15 minutes. Rule 6. During those 15 minutes, I did not leave the booth. I did not look out the east-facing window. I did not approach the door. I sat at the desk with my hands folded, and I watched the CCTV feeds, and I listened. The pump activated at 02:51 as expected. The feed distortion began at 02:40 as expected. The booth pressure dropped slightly at 2:47, slightly more than usual, and held at the lower pressure through 3:15. At 2:32 my timer had expired and I had not left the booth. I had decided, sitting there, that I would not attempt the stairwell again until after the window closed. At 3:18, 3 minutes after the window ended, I opened the booth door. The air outside had the weight of sea air after a low tide, the iodine smell of exposed flats, which was wrong because it was not low tide, and I stood on the small platform at the top of the stair, and I looked down and I counted. 4 landings. I descended, counting as I went. 4. I reached the causeway. I walked the east side in the ordinary course of the 02:15 walk-around, which was now 2 hours overdue. I passed the east berth. The bollard was warm. I had not touched it. I could feel the warmth off the iron as I passed, a soft, radiant heat at the level of my hand. The air around it was also warmer, a pocket of heat, perhaps 18 inches across. The bollard was the same one I had laid my hand on during my 8th shift. I did not put my hand on it now. I walked past and continued the round and returned to the booth, and I sat in the booth until 6 o'clock, and I signed out with my initials, and I drove to the cottage, and I packed my suitcase. I did not leave that morning. I want to be accurate about this. I packed the suitcase and I sat on the bed beside it, and I thought for about an hour. And then I unpacked. I told myself I would work one more shift, to think through what I had seen, to decide whether the stairwell had been fatigue or error. That is what I told myself. I know now that I unpacked the suitcase because I could not yet admit that I was afraid, and admitting that I was afraid required understanding what I was afraid of, and I had not yet reached that understanding. I worked the 13th shift. It was quiet. I worked the 14th. It was quiet. On the 15th shift, I heard Terminal 3 actual for the first time. The hail came over Channel 11 at 02:44. The voice was male, even-toned, neither old nor young. It did not sound distorted. The transmission quality was clean, cleaner than the usual Channel 11 traffic, which on that coast tended to be scratchy due to the distances involved. The voice said, "Terminal 3, actual. Terminal 3, actual. This is Marin approach. Request status." There was a pause. The voice said it again. "Terminal 3, actual. Marin approach. Status, please." I did not respond. Rule 4 was specific. I was Causeway 3. There was no Terminal 3 actual. I sat with my hands on the desk and I waited. After the second hail, there was a long silence. Then, at 02:47, the same voice said, "Terminal 3 actual Marsh. This is Marin approach. Status, please." It used my name. I did not move. I did not touch the radio. I did not acknowledge. The voice did not repeat. The rest of the window ran its course. The pump activated at 02:51. The pressure dropped. The feed distorted. At 3:15, the distortion cleared, and the air pressure returned to normal, and the channel was silent. I finished the shift. I signed out with my initials. I went to the cottage. I lay on the bed and I thought about Rule 4. The rule had prohibited responding to hails addressed to Terminal 3 actual. It had not said anything about hails addressed to Terminal 3 actual that also addressed me by name. The rule had been written without that variable. Someone had hailed Terminal 3 actual at some point in the past, and a rule had been written, and the rule had not anticipated the later development where Terminal 3 actual and the watchman's name would be used together. I thought about whether this meant the rule had failed, or whether it meant the rule had been adequate for an earlier version of the problem, and the problem had evolved. I thought about Donnelly's notebook. They are counting me. On my 16th shift, I looked at the radio log. The booth kept a radio log that recorded all Channel 11 traffic time stamped to the minute. The log was automatic, printing to a small thermal roll that was changed monthly. The current roll, which I unspooled across the desk, showed the 0244 and 0247 transmissions from the previous shift. The log captured the transmission times and the channel, but not the content. I rolled further back. The same time stamps appeared on the prior shift, and the one before that, and the one before that. I went back 3 weeks, which was the extent of the current roll. Every shift I had worked showed Channel 11 transmissions at 0244 and 0247. I had only heard the transmissions on the 15th shift. The log said they had been present on every shift. I pulled the previous thermal roll from the cabinet. It ran from mid-February through mid-May, covering Donnelly's last weeks and the 3 weeks Halsey had worked the booth alone. The 0244 and 0247 transmissions were present on every shift. I pulled the roll before that. The same. I pulled rolls at random from the cabinet, going back years. The transmissions were present on every night shift for as far back as the rolls went. I sat at the desk with the rolls spread around me. The radio had been hailing Terminal 3, actual every night for at least a decade, and probably for much longer. Donnelly had heard it. Whoever had written Rule 4 had heard it. I had only heard it on the 15th shift because I understood now. It had only then begun to address me by name. The rule had been written to prevent response. The name addition was new. It was not in the rule. It had not been anticipated. The rules were being added to in an unlabeled hand, and Rule 4 had last been updated sometime before my arrival, and the current situation exceeded Rule 4's scope. This was the point at which I began to reread the rules in a different way. Rule 3 was not about birds. Rule 3 was about the count. Do not count them. Something used the count. Rule 6 was not about stairs. Rule 6 was about whether the system had registered the watchman as present during the window. An extra landing meant the watchman had appeared on an inventory that should not contain him. Rule 5 was not about mooring lines. Rule 5 was about whether the watchman was capable of resolving the contradiction between the feed and the window, because the contradiction, once resolved, placed the watchman inside the version of the terminal where the vessel existed. Rule 1 was not about the east berth. Rule 1 was about observation as a two-way act. Rule 2 was not about the pump. Rule 2 was about writing. Do not log. Logging the pump meant admitting in the facility's official record that the facility was active at 0251, which admitted that something was being done, which required the watchman to be the person doing it, which placed him in the operation. Rule 7 was the rule I had understood least well. Sign out with initials only. Full signatures reserved for incident reports. There will be no incident reports. I looked at the shift book. I looked at the many months of initialed sign-outs stretching back through the binder. I found, buried in the stack, a single full signature from 2009. A watchman named Tremblay had signed his full name to a shift in November of that year. His handwriting was clear. After his signature, in a different hand, someone had written the words filed separately in the margin. There was no incident report in the binder corresponding to Tremblay's shift. I checked the personnel files. Tremblay's folder was empty. Not thin. Empty. An empty folder in the cabinet with his name on the tab, and nothing inside. I stood at the cabinet for a long time with the empty folder in my hand, and then I put it back, and I closed the drawer. And I understood that Rule 7 had been written because full signatures were retained differently than initials, and that retention differently was, in this context, a form of removal. On my 17th shift, at 02:19, I counted 5 landings on the stairwell again. I returned to the booth. I set the timer. The 15-minute wait began at 2:20. At 2:22, I heard the booth door unlatch. I was at the desk. The desk faces the east windows. The door is behind me. I heard the latch disengage and the hinge move, a quiet, mechanical sound, and I did not turn. I sat with my hands flat on the desk, and I looked straight ahead at the CCTV feeds, and I listened. I heard the door close. I heard a footstep on the linoleum. I heard the squeak of the chair at the secondary desk on the far side of the booth, which was not the desk I was at. I heard the scrape of a pen being picked up, the specific scrape of a ballpoint on a metal desk. I heard pages turn. I heard the pen move on paper. I heard breathing. The breathing was even and calm and unhurried, and it was not my breathing, and it was not coming from where I was sitting. I did not turn around. I understood that turning around would be the act that Rule 6 had been designed to prevent. The 15 minutes of waiting were not for the stairwell to reset. They were for the booth to empty. Rule 6 did not say the booth emptied during those minutes. I had assumed that, and the rule had not corrected me, and the correction was arriving now by demonstration. I sat at the desk for 13 minutes and 40 seconds, which is what the timer showed when the sound stopped. The pen was set down. The chair squeaked. A footstep. The door. The latch. The silence that followed was the same pressurized silence of the 02:40 to 03:15 window, although it was only 02:35. The timer ran out. I did not move for another full minute. Then I stood up slowly, and I turned around. The booth was empty. The secondary desk had the shift book on it. The shift book was open. It had been closed when I sat down. I walked to the secondary desk. The book was open to the current shift. My entries from earlier in the shift were on the page, in my handwriting, with my initials. Below my last entry, in a hand that was not mine, a single line had been added. It read, Marsh, present, 0222, logged. The initials at the end of the line were TE, which was the abbreviation some of the earlier pump log entries had used for thermal expansion. The ink was still slightly wet. I could smell it. The same ballpoint that had scraped the secondary desk. I did not descend the stairwell that night. I waited in the booth until 6 o'clock. I did not use the east-facing window. I did not look at the east berth. When Halsey arrived at 05:55, 15 minutes early, I showed him the shift book. I showed him the entry. He read it. He did not react. He closed the book. He said, I'll handle the sign-out. I said, that isn't my handwriting. He said, I know. He said it the way a man says a thing he has been preparing to say for a long time, and I understood, looking at him, that he had shown up early. because he had known what I would find. And that he had known, because Donnelly had probably shown him something similar, and Tremblay before Donnelly, and whoever before Tremblay, and that the rules had been added to the card in his handwriting, or in some of it, and that this was his job as much as the binder and the coffee. I quit that morning. I did not sign out. Halsey initialed the book for me and said he would file the paperwork. I did not ask what paperwork. I drove the cart to the cottage. I packed. The afternoon ferry was not scheduled, but the resident at the South Cove ran a small boat on demand, and I paid him $200 for the crossing. I was on the mainland by 6 in the evening. I drove inland that night. I did not stop driving until I was 400 miles from any coastline. I took a clerical job with a small freight insurance firm in central Pennsylvania. The firm processes cargo loss claims. I read reports and I verify chain of custody, and I reconcile manifest discrepancies, which is work I am suited to by temperament and background, and which keeps me in a small office during daylight hours. I rent a one-bedroom apartment on the second floor of a converted house. I have a landline because the apartment came with one, and because the cellular reception on the block is poor. I do not have a view of the water. I do not own a boat. I do not subscribe to marine weather services. I have not used a marine radio since the morning I left Marin Island. 3 months after I moved, my landline rang at 2:51. I was awake, because I had been awake at 2:51 every night since the island, lying in bed with the clock on the nightstand and the ceiling above me, waiting for the minute to pass so that I could go back to sleep. The ring was the ordinary ring of a landline, the old mechanical kind, because the phone in the apartment was an old unit the landlord had left behind. I let it ring 4 times. I picked it up. I did not speak. I held the receiver to my ear. The line was not silent. There was a low mechanical hum at the pitch of a 400 horsepower centrifugal transfer pump under moderate load. Behind the hum, quieter, there was the slow, rhythmic creak of fiber mooring line under strain. No voice, no breath, just the pump and the lines, and under both of them, very faint, the sound of the tide against pilings at a level approximately 1.4 feet higher than the chart would have predicted. I did not speak. I did not hang up. I held the receiver and I listened. At 3:02, the pump sounds stopped. The mooring creak continued. At 3:15, the creak stopped. The line went silent. The silence had the quality of the booth at 0316, the pressurized quality of a space that has been occupied and is now unoccupied. I held the receiver through the silence. At 0316, the line clicked once, and the ordinary dial tone returned. I set the receiver back on the cradle. The phone has rung at 2:51 every night since. I do not answer every time. When I do answer, I hear the same sequence. The pump, the lines, the tide, the silence at the end. I have not spoken into the phone, and nothing has ever spoken out of it. I have considered having the line disconnected. I have not disconnected it. I tell myself this is because disconnection would require a formal request to the provider, and the request would generate a record, and the record would be filed somewhere. And a record in a file with my name on it is a thing I have learned to be careful about. That is what I tell myself. The truth is that I understand now that I was right about Rule 4. The hails at 0244 and 0247 had been present on every thermal roll for years, and I'd only heard them when they began to use my name. Something had been addressing Terminal 3 actual for a long time, without reaching anyone. When it reached me, it did so by name. It still has my name. It is still making the call. The difference is that I am no longer at the station, and the system is adjusting, and the call is coming through on the nearest line that still recognizes me. I've thought about the rules often since I left. I have tried to understand whether the rules were written to protect the watchman from the operation, or to protect the operation from the watchman. I have settled on a third reading, which is the one I believe. The rules were written to maintain a separation. The operation existed. The watchman existed. The rules kept them from intersecting. Each time a rule was added, it was because an intersection had begun to occur that the previous rules had not anticipated, and the new rule was an attempt to restore the separation before the intersection completed. Rule 7 had been the most recent rule in the laminated card. Rule 7 was about how the facility remembered its watchman. Initials were a kind of memory the facility could release. Full signatures were a kind it could not. Tremblay had signed his full name. Tremblay's file was empty. The rule had been written after Tremblay. I do not know what rule would have been written after me if I had stayed. I have a guess. The guess is that Rule 8 would have addressed the phone. It would have said something like, "Incoming calls at station line outside business hours are to be allowed to ring. Do not answer. Do not disconnect." It would have been written in an unlabeled hand on the laminated card, and it would have seemed, to the next watchman, to be one of the older rules rather than one of the newer ones, because by the time he arrived, it would have been there long enough to have rounded corners. I'm writing this down because Donnelly wrote things down, and because Tremblay signed his name, and because I cannot decide whether writing it down is a form of incident report or a form of initialing. I do not know which one this is. I do not know whether a man who is no longer at the station can still generate a separation-violating record, or whether the record I am making now is just another thermal roll that will sit in a cabinet somewhere for years before someone hears it. I suspect it is the second. I suspect that the rules have, in some sense, followed me, and that the phone ringing at 2:51 is the system's way of observing me in the absence of a booth, and that the appropriate response is the one I have been giving, which is to listen without speaking. I have not spoken into the phone. I will not. Last week, the phone rang at 2:44 instead of 2:51. The hum began earlier than usual, and behind the hum I heard, for the first time, what I had not heard on any previous call. A voice. Clean transmission quality. Male, even-toned. It said once, very quietly, Terminal 3. Actual. Marsh. This is Marin approach. Status, please. I did not acknowledge. I did not respond. I held the receiver, and I listened to the hum until 3:16, and then the line clicked once, and the dial tone returned, and I set the receiver down. The phone rang again the next night at the usual time, and the voice did not return. It has not returned since. I understand that it will. I understand that when it does, it will have changed the question, and the question will be one that Rule 4 did not anticipate. And I will have to decide. Sitting in the dark in a second-floor apartment 400 miles from any coastline, what the rule would have said if someone had thought to write it, I have not decided. I am listening. The bollard I know now. was warm because something was resting on it. I could not see what was resting on it. I could feel the heat of what had been. The heat was the observation I was not supposed to make. The rule about the east berth had been clear. I had made the observation anyway, on my 8th shift, by laying my hand on the iron, and I had initialed the entry, and the facility had recorded the observation, and from that point forward, I had been part of the count. Rule 3 had not been about the birds. It had been about me. The phone is ringing.